Little Elijah loved telling folks his dad flew planes and wore a coat with 4 shining stars. But his teacher, Miss Carroll, just laughed, saying big dreams are just stories. He felt his heart crack right there in class, the silence screaming around him. Stayed to the very end because she said something no one expected. Kindly endeavor to like, subscribe, and comment what you learned if you find this story intriguing. This will enable it reach others who needs to see it. Elijah was a happy boy, all sunshine and big eyes, and he lived for the moment when he could talk about his daddy. Daddy wasn't like other dads. Daddy was tall and strong, and his hands were always warm when he held Elijah's small ones. But the biggest thing about Daddy was his job. He was a general in the army. Not just any general, but a 4-star general, which meant he was a superhero without a cape, guiding entire armies and giving important orders that kept the whole country safe. Elijah knew this job was rare, like finding a shiny penny in a bucket of rocks. He was so proud. His third-grade classroom was bright with big windows, but one day, the sunlight seemed to dim just to him. Miss Carroll, his teacher, was doing a lesson about careers. She loved to talk about how doctors help people and how engineers build bridges. When it was Elijah's turn, he stood up straight, puffed out his chest a little, and his voice was clear and loud, like a trumpet call. "My daddy is a general, a 4-star general. He commands thousands of soldiers, and sometimes he flies on the really big planes, and he wears the shiny medals." A few kids said, "Wow," and "cool," but Miss Carroll stopped writing on the board. She turned around slowly, and there was a look on her face that made Elijah's stomach feel like it was full of cold rocks. It wasn't a mean look, not exactly, but it was a look of complete, solid doubt. She smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "That's a very imaginative story, Elijah," she said, her voice sounding sickly sweet like cheap candy. "We all love to pretend our parents have special, exciting jobs. Perhaps your father is a policeman, or maybe he works at the post office. Those are important jobs too." Elijah's chest shrunk. He didn't like the word imaginative. That's what you call stories about dragons and talking dogs. This was the truth. "No, Miss Carroll, he is. He has the 4 stars on his shoulder. He's gone to meetings with the president." Miss Carroll walked right up to his desk. She leaned down so her face was close, but she was looking past him, maybe at the wall. She put her hand on his shoulder and squeezed gently, but her words felt hard. "Elijah, we must be honest. It's not good to exaggerate. Those positions are held by very few people, and often children confuse a simple military rank with a general. It's okay. We all want our parents to be heroes, but let's keep our feet on the ground, sweetie. You're a smart boy, so let's talk about something real. What does your mother do?" The entire class was silent now. Elijah felt every pair of eyes burning holes into him. He wasn't lying. He knew the difference between general and sergeant because he had a whole book about ranks. The general's coat was hanging up in the closet at home, protected in a big plastic bag. This grown-up, this person he trusted to teach him math and reading, was calling him a liar in front of everyone. He couldn't even look up at her. He just mumbled about his mom being a lawyer, but the magic was gone. That day, Elijah walked home with a heavy feeling, like his backpack was filled with bricks. He didn't want to go back to school. He felt small and wrong. When he saw his dad, General Williams, getting ready for a trip, Elijah ran and hugged his legs tight. "Daddy, you really are a general, right?" he whispered into the uniform pants. General Williams laughed, a big, warm sound. "Last time I checked, son, yes I am. Did something happen in school?" Elijah told him everything, keeping his head down. He told his dad how Miss Carroll used a sweet, fake voice and said his story was imaginative. The general's face didn't get mad, but it got still. That was always the sign that Daddy was listening very carefully, the way he did when someone gave him important reports. "I believe you, Elijah," his dad said, kneeling down and looking him right in the eye. "But it sounds like Miss Carroll needs to see it to believe it, which is all right. Sometimes people can't imagine what they haven't seen." A few weeks later, the school planned a big event, My Favorite Things Day, where a few parents would come in and talk about their jobs. Miss Carroll had already invited a baker and a local fire chief. Elijah hadn't volunteered as dad, but General Williams, knowing his son was still hurting, had called the principal himself and arranged a very special visit. The general didn't tell Elijah he was coming. He wanted it to be a surprise, a big moment of truth for his boy.
The morning of My Favorite Things Day was awful for Elijah. He sat at his desk, picking at the corner of his spelling worksheet. Every time Miss Carroll walked past, he felt that old, cold feeling come back. He knew his dad was busy, miles away at the big military base, so the general wouldn't be coming. This meant Miss Carroll would win. She would think he gave up on his imaginative story. The fire chief spoke first. He was nice and showed them his big red helmet. Miss Carroll kept looking at Elijah and smiling that tight, uncomfortable smile. It felt like she was saying, "See, we have the nice, real heroes here, not the ones from your stories." Then a baker came in, and they got to decorate cupcakes. The kids were laughing, but Elijah couldn't taste the sweetness of the frosting. He was waiting for Miss Carroll to say something again, something dismissive like, "Elijah, maybe your dad bakes all the general's cakes?" Finally, the baker packed up her sprinkles. Miss Carroll clapped her hands together brightly. "All right, class, that was wonderful. Now we have one last special guest slot. We don't have another parent here today, but I do want to talk a little bit about responsibility and—" She stopped herself. She glanced quickly at the clock on the wall, checking her schedule. The general was supposed to arrive during this time slot, but Miss Carroll was sure he wouldn't. She had tried to look up the names of the few four-star generals online after Elijah's first claim, and not seeing anyone with the name she assumed, had dismissed it entirely. She was convinced Elijah was just a sweet kid with an overactive imagination, and that she, the adult, had done the right thing by gently correcting his delusion. This belief made her feel very smug and in control. She looked at Elijah, who was now staring down at his sticky cupcake. She decided to use this moment as a quiet, final lesson. "Elijah, sweetie, why don't you take your cupcake up to the principal's office? It's a bit of a mess. You know, sometimes it's better to clean up small messes before they become big ones," she said. It sounded like she was just talking about the crumbs, but the subtext, the quiet, knowing look, felt like a direct hit on his character. She was telling him, "Go deal with your big, messy lie somewhere else." Elijah stood up, his eyes suddenly burning with tears. He felt shame rushing into his cheeks. He clutched the cupcake plate, ready to make his escape, his final defeat. Just as he reached the classroom door, a sound ripped through the quiet hallway outside. It wasn't a school bell or a locker slamming. It was the sound of heavy, polished leather boots hitting the linoleum. A rhythmic, purposeful thud, thud, thud. It was the sound of authority, and it grew louder, stopping right outside their door. Miss Carroll's head snapped up. Even the kids froze, their mouths full of cake. She had only invited a fireman and a baker. Who could this be? The door didn't just open, it was pushed open with a firm, confident movement. And standing in the doorway was the biggest, most important-looking man Elijah had ever seen. Even the principal's suit looked like pajamas next to him. He was in a full, crisp dress uniform, the fabric dark and starched. On his shoulders, shining brightly under the classroom lights, were 4 perfect silver stars. And his face? It was Daddy, General Williams. He was magnificent. He filled the doorway, his chest covered in colorful ribbons and medals. He looked like the picture of the general on the book Elijah kept at home. The room went absolutely silent, the kind of silence where you could hear the clock ticking and your own heart pounding. Miss Carroll's face, which had been bright with controlled cheer just a second ago, went completely, sickly white. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She didn't look like a teacher anymore. She looked like a deer caught in the headlights of a big, fast truck. She recognized the uniform, the rank, the sheer presence of the man standing there. This was no post office worker. This was the real deal. This was a 4-star general. Elijah, dropping his cupcake plate, which thankfully landed on the carpet, let out a little gasp of pure, unadulterated relief and joy. General Williams stood tall, his eyes sweeping the room until they landed on his son, who was frozen by the door. He offered a small, knowing smile. Then he looked at Miss Carroll, who was now frozen solid next to the whiteboard, unable to move or speak a single word.
The general took 2 steps into the room, and the air shifted, like a sudden cool breeze had swept away all the disbelief and shame. He didn't look angry. He looked calm and serious, the way a general should look when taking charge of a situation. "My apologies for the dramatic entrance," General Williams said, his voice deep and warm, but with a certain commanding tone that made everyone listen. "I am General Williams, and I believe I have the 9:45 slot to speak to the 3rd grade about my job." He glanced over at Miss Carroll, who looked like she might melt right into the floor. She finally managed a weak, shaky whisper. "General, I didn't realize. I am so sorry. I thought Elijah was just—" She trailed off, unable to say the word lying in front of the man whose authority she had so carelessly dismissed. The general walked slowly over to Elijah and kneeled down, the way he did when Elijah was asking him for bedtime stories. He put his hands on Elijah's shoulders, the 4 stars of his rank now perfectly visible. "Son, you ready for your dad to talk about how he defends freedom?" Elijah just nodded, his eyes shining. He didn't need words. The general's presence was the loudest truth he could ever speak. General Williams stood up and looked directly at Miss Carroll, but he spoke to the class. This was the unexpected outcome. He didn't come to demand an apology. He came to give a lesson. "Children," the general said, his voice softer now, "my job is to lead, but before I could lead, I had to learn. And the first thing I learned is that you must never, ever let someone else's small view of the world make your dreams small. Elijah told you the truth, and he felt hurt when his truth was called into question. Why?" He paused, letting the silence hang. He looked straight at Miss Carroll, but he was still talking to the kids. "Because some people see a young black boy, and, without even realizing it, they cannot imagine that his daddy could be a 4-star general. They let their eyes tell them a story that isn't true. My challenge to all of you is this: don't ever let a uniform or a title trick you into thinking someone is less important than they are. And never, ever let someone else's low expectations become your own." He then smiled brightly. "Now, who wants to hear about the time I flew over the ocean and the plane got hit by lightning?" The entire class erupted in cheers. The shame was gone, replaced by wonder. Miss Carroll, still standing stiffly, her face red, finally found her voice again, and this was the unexpected thing she said, the quiet conclusion to the whole dramatic show. She wasn't just apologizing to the general, she was apologizing to the boy and to herself. "Class," she said, her voice genuinely trembling. "Before the general speaks, I have to say something. I owe Elijah a real apology. I was wrong. I let my own lack of imagination take away his moment of pride. Elijah, I am truly sorry for calling your truth a story. Thank you for showing me what's possible." She said it with real feeling, and Elijah, standing tall again, smiled at her. It wasn't a triumphant smile, just a boy's honest forgiveness. The general, seeing the lesson had landed, nodded once, and then began his incredible story, making every child, even Miss Carroll, remembered that some dreams are not just imaginative, they are wonderfully, powerfully real. Thanks for watching. Did you enjoy the story?